The smell of old hay mixed with animal sweat hung heavy in the dusty air of the auction barn. The sound of boots crunching over dry sawdust echoed like a nervous clock ticking toward something inevitable. The auction had been going for over an hour, and the buyers, men and women with weathered faces and tired eyes, assessed each animal like tools, not living beings. Then, the gate creaked open once more, and the room fell completely silent. The horse was a picture of despair. His chestnut coat was swarming with flies, hundreds of them, clinging to his skinny, malnourished body like moving scars. His ribs jutted sharply beneath his dull skin, and his eyes seemed to hold a quiet sorrow, as if he'd already given up. Some of the onlookers chuckled under their breath. Others looked away. It was uncomfortable to watch, almost cruel. "Should have put that one down already," someone muttered. The auctioneer tried to stir the crowd, but not a single hand rose. At the back of the pen, leaning against a worn wooden rail, stood an old man. He wore a faded leather jacket and a sweat-stained cap that looked like it had survived decades of sun, storms, and hard work. But his eyes had no age. They were the kind that had seen too much, lost too much, and still kept looking. When the horse passed in front of him, the old man narrowed his gaze. While everyone else saw flies and bones, he saw something else. Something nobody else noticed. The auctioneer was ready to move on when a rough voice cut through the murmurs. "I'll give 50. Heads turned. It was the old man. A few people scoffed. "You serious?" someone asked, half laughing. But Lemuel didn't answer. He stepped forward, locking eyes with the horse like they shared some unspoken history. The scene felt surreal. Why would anyone pay for an animal that looked like it was already halfway to the grave? The horse didn't flinch at the sound, as if the world no longer had any meaning to him. But Lemuel saw beyond the obvious. He saw something that pulled him in, something buried deep in the animal's broken posture. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in the horse, not in the crowd, but in the air itself, like the beginning of a story no one expected to be told. Lemuel hadn't stepped foot in that auction barn in over 12 years. Not since the fire. Not since Inez. But something had pulled him there that day, a feeling he couldn't name. He told himself he came just to look, maybe to check on old friends or see how the market had changed. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. The truth had been gnawing at him for years, growing louder in the quiet moments on the porch, in the rustle of dry leaves, in the way the wind carried her name. Inez. He loaded the horse onto his old trailer with care, though it was clear the animal could barely stand. Each step the creature took seemed like a silent cry for rest. Lemuel didn't rush. He remembered what it felt like to be broken, to move slow, to fear touch. The drive back to his ranch took over an hour, winding through empty roads and memories. He didn't turn on the radio. The silence suited him. It gave space for ghosts. Back at the ranch, Lemuel led the horse to the far paddock, overgrown and used for years. He hadn't kept horses since the fire. Since everything changed. He filled the water trough, threw down hay, then stood back and watched. The horse didn't eat. He just stared at the fence, swaying slightly. Lemuel sighed and lowered himself onto the old bench Inez had painted a lifetime ago. The chipping blue paint still held the shape of her brushstrokes, like fingerprints left on time. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, Lemuel's mind drifted. He remembered Inez brushing down a mare named Dahlia, humming softly, sunlight caught in her curls. She always had a way with wounded things. "They don't need saving," she used to say. "They just need someone who sees them." He wondered what she would have thought of this horse, this pile of bones and flies. He already knew. The horse remained still for hours. Lemuel kept a chair by the paddock and waited, saying nothing. Just breathing. Just being there. On the second night, the horse limped closer to the fence. Not to eat. Not to drink, just to be near him. It was small, barely a change. But Lemuel noticed. It reminded him of something he'd once felt with Inez, a silent kind of trust, the kind that isn't given, only earned. He didn't know why he'd chosen that horse. Not really. But as the stars came out and the cicadas began to sing, Lemuel felt it again, that strange tug in his chest, like a door unlocking. He didn't know what he was walking into, but deep down, he knew he was walking towards something that had been waiting for years. By the end of the first week, Lemuel had begun calling the horse Ghost. Not out loud, not yet, but in his mind, the name fit. The animal moved like a shadow, quiet and watchful, as if tethered to some invisible pain. Lemuel knew that feeling. Every creak of the porch boards, every half-empty coffee mug, every unopened letter still stacked in the kitchen drawer, it all echoed a life that once had laughter, then silence. Inez had been the only person who ever softened his edges. Her loss had left him sharp and hollow. One morning, as Lemuel cleaned out the tack shed for the first time in years, he found an old photograph tucked inside a leather saddlebag. It was sun-bleached and curled at the edges, but the image was unmistakable. Inez, standing beside a horse that looked nearly identical to Ghost. His breath caught. It couldn't be. The blaze down the nose, the same deep-set eyes, even the posture. It was all too familiar. That photo was from nearly 20 years ago. "Dahlia," he whispered, tracing the outline with a shaking finger. Lemuel tried to shake it off, chalking it up to coincidence. But it stayed with him like a thorn in the brain. What if Ghost wasn't just another broken animal? What if there was a reason he'd felt drawn to the auction that day? He started checking for a brand, a scar, anything that could link Ghost to Dahlia's bloodline. And then, one night, under the barn light, he saw it, a small crescent-shaped scar on the horse's back leg, just like the one Dahlia got after a barbed wire fence tore into her years ago. Lemuel staggered back. The memories came fast after that. Inez, holding a newborn foal in her arms, tears in her eyes. "She's going to carry something big in her," she'd said. Lemuel never paid attention to her talk of intuition back then. Now he wished he had. Ghost wasn't Dahlia, but he was part of her. Lemuel could feel it. And that realization hit harder than he expected. Because it meant something else. Someone had lied. Ghost had a past, a bloodline, maybe even a purpose, and whoever dumped him at that auction had known none of it. Lemuel found himself restless, pacing the floor at night, haunted by questions. Who had owned this horse? How had it ended up in that condition? And why, after all these years, did a piece of Inez's world come walking back into his life, barely alive? He felt like he was chasing shadows, chasing Inez's voice in the wind. And deep in his gut, Lemuel felt something dangerous stirring, not just memories, but a need for answers. Because now, it wasn't just about saving Ghost. It was about uncovering a truth long buried, one that might change everything he thought he knew. The following days turned into a quiet obsession. Lemuel, who hadn't used a computer in over a decade, found himself squinting at an old laptop covered in dust. He sat in the kitchen at night, fingers stiff on the keyboard, searching through livestock registries, auction records, anything that might lead him to Ghost's origin. The scar proved lineage, but he needed more. Something concrete. And in the process, he began digging up more than horse records. He began digging into pieces of himself he thought were long gone. One night, while searching an old breeding archive from Kentucky, he found a name that froze him: Sunfire's Redemption. The photo in the record was blurry, but the face was unmistakable. It was Ghost, registered under a different name, part of a once-prized bloodline known for endurance and intelligence. But the last listed owner made Lemuel's heart stutter. James Cutter. A name from his past. A name Inez had once begged him to forget. James had been a trainer, charming and smooth-talking, who once worked at Lemuel's ranch back when Inez was still alive. He'd vanished after a money dispute that ended badly, and Lemuel always suspected he'd taken more than a paycheck when he left. Inez had defended James back then, claimed he had a good heart. Lemuel hadn't believed her. Their last argument before the fire had been about that very man. And now, James's name was tied to the horse standing in Lemuel's paddock. The past clawed at him with new urgency. Lemuel stared at the empty chair across the table, where Inez used to sit with her tea, her laughter echoing through the house. Now he wondered, had she known something he didn't? Had James come back after the fire? Was it possible that Inez had hidden the truth from him? His hands trembled as he closed the laptop, the screen flickering off like a dying memory. Ghost whinnied outside, low and soft, as if feeling the weight of something rising. The next morning, Lemuel drove out to the county clerk's office. He needed addresses, any paper trail leading to James Cutter. The clerk, a young woman with bright pink nails and a wary smile, took her time. When she finally returned with a folder, her face had changed. "You said you knew this man?" she asked, her voice quiet. Lemuel nodded. "Well, he died 3 years ago. But before that, he sold a string of animals under false names. There's a whole investigation file here. You sure you want to see it?" Lemuel stared at the folder. His fingers hovered over the cover, the air thick with a silence that felt like thunder. Something inside told him that whatever was in those pages would unravel more than just a name. It would crack open everything he thought he knew about Inez, about the fire, and about why Ghost had really found his way back to him. The folder was heavier than it looked. Lemuel carried it out to his truck like it held the ashes of a long-dead truth. He didn't open it right away. He sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, hands gripping the worn leather cover, feeling his pulse in his fingertips. Something told him that once he looked inside, there would be no going back. The pages would stain his memory forever. But the silence, the not knowing, had already become unbearable. Back at the ranch, Lemuel sat at the old kitchen table, the one Inez had sanded and varnished with her own hands. He laid the folder down and opened it slowly. Inside were reports, affidavits, sale records. James Cutter had been under investigation for years, selling valuable animals under fake names, abusing trust, falsifying bloodlines. And then Lemuel saw it, a photograph. Ghost. Listed as Sunfire's Redemption. Sold illegally 6 years ago. Transferred through 2 hands. Abandoned. Forgotten. One of dozens. But what made Lemuel's breath catch wasn't just the scam. It was a handwritten note at the bottom of one report. Owner suspected to be personal associate of Inez Rayburn. Possible familial dispute regarding original ownership. See attached letter. There it was. Inez's name, in ink, tied to all of it. Lemuel's eyes scanned the next page, and there it was, her handwriting. A letter. Never sent. Addressed to James. She had written him, months before the fire. The words stung. "James, I never told Lemuel. I couldn't. You were right. He would have never forgiven me for what we did with Dahlia's last foal. But it was the only way to keep the ranch. I'm sorry. I hope someday you'll understand. Inez." Lemuel's vision blurred. His hands trembled as he placed the letter down. Inez had kept secrets. The woman he thought he'd known better than anyone had chosen to lie, to protect something or someone. She had given up Dahlia's foal, Ghost, in a deal with the very man who had betrayed them. And she had hidden it from him, carrying that weight alone until the fire took her away. Lemuel felt the floor tilt beneath him. The horse outside wasn't just a remnant of her past. He was the embodiment of her silence. He stumbled outside, heart racing, breath shallow. Ghost stood near the fence, lifting his head as Lemuel approached. Their eyes met, one man and one broken animal, both shaped by the same betrayal. Lemuel reached out, resting a hand on Ghost's neck. The horse didn't flinch. For the first time, he leaned in. And in that quiet moment beneath the dying light, Lemuel understood something he hadn't before. The horse wasn't just a mystery to solve, he was Inez's final message. A piece of truth she couldn't speak aloud, but had somehow sent back to him anyway. The days after the discovery moved slowly, like walking through deep snow. Lemuel didn't speak much. Not to the neighbors, not to the postman, not even to the wind. He moved around the ranch like a man learning to walk again, haunted but grounded by something new. Ghost had begun to eat regularly, his coat growing less dull, the flies now fewer. Each morning, Lemuel would brush him down in silence, feeling something shift between them, a wordless understanding. He placed Inez's letter back in its envelope, but didn't lock it away. Instead, he kept it on the table near the window, where the morning sun hit the wood just right. He would glance at it sometimes, not with anger, but with ache. He no longer saw her as flawless. He saw her as real. A woman who made choices, hard ones. A woman who had tried to hold everything together while he remained too proud, too rigid to see what was slipping away. The ranch had begun to breathe again. Lemuel started clearing the overgrown fields. He repaired the broken barn door, the one that had swung aimlessly for years. He pulled out old equipment, cleaned the troughs, and oiled saddles that hadn't felt a hand in over a decade. It wasn't about rebuilding the past, it was about honoring what was left. Ghost followed him often, not like a pet, but like a quiet companion who carried part of the truth with him. One afternoon, while fixing the old windmill behind the paddock, Lemuel heard hooves. Not trotting, but running, steady and strong. He turned and saw Ghost, muscles tight, mane dancing, charging across the open pasture. It wasn't perfect. He was still thin, still limping slightly, but there was life in him. Fire. Lemuel leaned on the wooden post, breath caught in his throat. He remembered something Inez had said long ago: "You don't fix broken things. You show them they were never useless." The guilt still lingered. For not seeing what Inez had carried. For how stubborn he'd been. For how fast he'd let the ranch and her memory fade into dust. But now, there was movement again. Purpose. Lemuel didn't speak much of James Cutter after that. He'd done damage, yes, but so had silence. Lemuel wasn't ready to forgive all of it. But he was willing to stop running from it. That evening, as the sun fell behind the hills, Lemuel stood beside Ghost and whispered, "You were never meant to be forgotten." The horse flicked his ear, and for the first time, pressed his head gently against Lemuel's chest. It wasn't healing yet, but it was beginning. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Lemuel almost didn't answer. It had rung so rarely over the years that he sometimes forgot it even worked. But something in his gut told him to pick it up. The voice on the other end was soft, cautious. "Mr. Rayburn? This is Clara Simmons from the State Rescue Registry. We believe the horse you acquired, Sunfire's Redemption, might be eligible for rehabilitation recognition. If you're interested, there's an evaluation happening next month." Lemuel didn't answer right away. His fingers gripped the receiver, heart caught somewhere between pride and fear. That night, he sat on the porch, watching the stars come out like old memories. He thought about the ranch as it once was, full of movement, voices, hope. The idea of entering Ghost into any kind of evaluation felt risky, almost cruel. The horse was healing, yes, but he was still fragile. And Lemuel wasn't sure if he was ready to be seen again either. But something in him, it sounded like Inez, whispered, "You owe him the chance. Not just the horse. Himself." He drove out to see an old friend the next day. Walter Briggs, a man Lemuel hadn't spoken to in over a decade. They had fallen out after Inez's death. Too many harsh words, too much grief between them. Walter was grayer now, his walk slower, but his eyes were the same. Skeptical, kind, and sharp. When Lemuel asked for help training Ghost, Walter didn't speak for a long while. Then, with a slow nod, he simply said, "Took you long enough." They started the next morning. Not with saddles or reins, but with ground work. Ghost was hesitant but responsive, his ears twitching to every sound, every motion. Lemuel moved slow, patient, listening more than commanding. Walter watched from the fence, offering quiet advice, never pushing. The sessions weren't perfect. There were moments of fear, of resistance, but Ghost never bucked, never quit. Lemuel saw something building in the animal's eyes, trust. And maybe, in his own reflection, he saw the same. A week before the evaluation, Ghost startled during a thunderstorm and re-injured his leg. Lemuel found him limping in the rain, eyes wide with panic. He dropped to his knees beside him, arms around the animal's soaked frame. "You don't have to prove anything," he whispered. "Not to them. Not to me." But Ghost, even in pain, nudged forward, trying to stand. It was as if he refused to stay broken. The morning of the evaluation came clear and cool. Lemuel loaded Ghost into the trailer with quiet determination. The journey ahead was uncertain, but no longer haunted by silence. This time, Lemuel wasn't trying to outrun the past. He was bringing it with him. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The fairgrounds were busier than Lemuel had expected. Trucks, trailers, and strangers filled every inch of the open lot. He hadn't been in a crowd like this since Inez's memorial. Too much noise, too many unfamiliar faces. Ghost stepped off the trailer slowly, his ears alert, his breath steady. Lemuel placed a steadying hand on his flank. "Just you and me," he murmured, more to himself than the horse. And Ghost didn't flinch. That alone felt like a victory. The evaluation ring was surrounded by curious eyes, some kind, others skeptical. A clipboard judge stepped forward to take Lemuel's registration papers. "Sunfire's redemption?" she read aloud, glancing at the horse. "Thought that bloodline was gone." Lemuel didn't answer. He simply nodded. The judge raised an eyebrow but moved on. As Ghost entered the ring, heads turned. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Some recognized the horse or thought they did. Others just saw something in him, a story trying to speak. Ghost moved slowly at first, cautious but focused. Lemuel guided him with small gestures, letting the rhythm build naturally. The horse's gait, though imperfect, was steady. Each step was deliberate, every turn a quiet triumph. The crowd began to lean in, drawn not by perfection, but by resilience. This wasn't a show horse. This was a survivor. And in that space, the two of them, man and beast, became something more than broken things. They became proof of what still lived after loss. Near the end of the evaluation, a woman stepped to the fence, her voice soft but clear. "Is that Inez Rayburn's old line?" Lemuel turned. Her face was unfamiliar, but her tone was full of memory. "I knew her. She used to talk about a foal that would change everything." Lemuel's throat tightened. He gave a small nod, then returned his gaze to Ghost. The moment stretched, past, present, and grief colliding in the open air. When the evaluation ended, Ghost stood still at the center of the ring. No applause, no grand announcement, just a quiet nod from the judge and a checkmark on the clipboard. But Lemuel didn't need a ribbon. He walked over, placed a hand on the horse's neck, and smiled. "You did good, boy." Ghost leaned into him, the tension in his frame finally easing. As they walked back toward the trailer, Lemuel noticed the people who stepped aside, not with pity, but with respect. For the first time in years, he wasn't just the man who'd lost everything. He was the man who'd brought something back. And as Ghost followed calmly behind him, head held just a little higher, Lemuel felt something inside him shift. Not an ending. Not yet. But the beginning of something worth holding on to. The morning after the evaluation, Lemuel stood by the paddock with a mug of coffee in his hand, watching Ghost move across the field. The flies were mostly gone now. Only a few still hovered, easily brushed away by the horse's flicking tail. Weeks ago, his coat had been so caked in filth and insects that his true color was hidden. Now, beneath the morning sun, his rich chestnut coat gleamed with hints of red, a living ember rising from the ashes. That white blaze down the center of his face, once buried under grime, stood out bright and proud, like a banner of survival. It amazed Lemuel how much could be hidden beneath dirt and silence. Ghost had looked like a lost cause, just bones and bugs. But now, there was strength in every step, purpose in every glance. Lemuel had started to see the same in himself. He had stopped sleeping on the couch, stopped eating from cans. He opened windows again. Let the wind move through the house like Inez once had. Sometimes he even caught himself humming. He had a visitor that week, Clara Simmons from the rescue registry. She walked slowly through the paddock, notebook in hand, but eyes full of warmth. When she saw Ghost up close, she paused. "He's one of the lucky ones," she said. "Most horses don't come back from where he's been." Lemuel nodded, hand resting on the gate. "He didn't come back," he said quietly. "He found a way forward." That night, Lemuel sat on the porch and took out the photo of Inez, her smiling beside Dahlia, the mare who had started it all. He thought about the letter, the secrets, the fire. For so long, he had carried anger like a badge. But now, he saw it for what it was, a wound he'd refused to let heal. He whispered into the dusk, "I forgive you, Inez." The words didn't fix everything, but they opened a door. And behind it, he felt peace waiting. Ghost stood near the fence, ears flicking, head tilted as if listening. Lemuel walked over and ran his hand down the horse's neck, feeling the strong muscles beneath the coat. "You were never a ghost," he murmured. "I just didn't know how to see you." The horse leaned into him, and for the first time, Lemuel felt like he was holding on to something real, not just a memory, but a future. And in that quiet moment, he realized he was no longer trying to outrun the past. He was walking beside it, finally whole. Spring came early that year. The fields around Lemuel's ranch bloomed with wildflowers he hadn't seen in decades, yellow, violet, white. The air carried the smell of wet earth and fresh grass, and the old barn, once silent and forgotten, now echoed with the soft clatter of hooves and the creak of new life. Ghost stood tall in the paddock, his coat thick and gleaming, the white blaze on his face almost glowing in the sunlight. There was no trace of the starving, fly-covered shadow he had once been. Neighbors who had kept their distance for years began stopping by. Some came to see the horse. Others came to see Lemuel, the man who, for so long, had been a fixture of silence and solitude. Now they found him different. Lighter. Not cheerful, but peaceful. The kind of peace that comes only after surviving the worst and choosing to keep going anyway. When someone asked what changed, Lemuel simply said, "He showed up looking like death. But he gave me my life back." Lemuel turned a section of the ranch into a small rescue pasture. Not a business, not a formal sanctuary. Just a place where a few lost animals could rest, heal, and, if they were lucky, find someone who saw them for who they were. Ghost was always the first to greet them. Somehow he knew. He would walk beside the new arrivals, quiet and steady, the same way Lemuel had once walked beside him. Every evening, Lemuel sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sun dip below the ridge. Sometimes he read. Sometimes he listened to old records Inez used to love. But most nights, he just sat in silence, with Ghost grazing nearby, and the stars blinking open one by one. It no longer hurt to remember. The fire, the loss, the letter, they were part of the story. But they weren't the ending. One day, a young girl from a nearby town came with her father to meet Ghost. She'd lost her own horse in a flood and hadn't smiled in months. Ghost walked right up to her, gently nudged her shoulder, and lowered his head into her arms. She cried into his neck, and Lemuel watched from the fence, heart full. That was the moment he knew. Ghost had come back for more than just him. He was meant to carry others too. And so, under the open sky, with a horse who was never truly lost, and a heart no longer chained to grief, Lemuel began the final chapter of his life, not as the man who lost everything, but as the man who chose to love again.